Okay, so this is our first code along assignment. And this is an assignment. So this work, and I previewed that just to give you the images when you're looking at Canvas. Now I'm looking at it not in the student mode, but in the teacher mode. So this is an assignment that you will turn in. And I will show you at the end of this assignment a new way you'll turn in assignments, because we'll talk a lot about commits and the importance of them. But before we do that, just a little bit of setup because I think it's important. And again, I'm trying to kind of step back and make sure I've covered those really important bases. So with JavaScript, again, it's not Java, it's JavaScript. Kind of the definitive source for reference is MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, which is Mozilla, who builds Firefox and other products. So if you click on here, it takes you to the Mozilla site, or sorry, the docs site for MDN, and it actually specifically takes you into the JavaScript section. So if you read through here, there'll be a lot of stuff that, especially if you're new to this, will just seem like, what are they talking about, right? But JavaScript is a lightweight interpreted. Now, interpreted just means the way the computer handles running the commands that you've given it. Because there's compiled and interpreted is kind of the two big categories. This is also what we call just-in-time compiled, even though it's interpreted. So, words. Programming language, right? So it is a programming language. Now, and I talked about this in week 1, the very first attendance, like JavaScript is so popular because of because it runs on almost all websites. There are things that are starting to eat into its market share, but still it remains on top, right? So mostly used in the browser, but there are also some non-browser ways to use it. So one thing, and I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but having a little understanding of, and it doesn't hurt, even though you don't have all the words, and it's linked here like Node.js and talks about other ways it's used. It's a dynamic, JavaScript's dynamic, what we call dynamic typing, and you'll see that when we get into variables next and other functions. Other things, functions are specific. But, and this is the part I guess I would just emphasize again, because I often hear students, and for those of us programming JavaScript, when we hear people call it Java, we're like, no, Java's very different. But honestly, doesn't make a difference. Programmers, coders tend to be very, what I call opinionated. So, and then here's the guide, right? So here's, learning the first steps. So I'm actually going to come in here. And then this gives an introduction. Now this class does not cover HTML and CSS. We will talk about it as we need it related to what we're doing. Getting started, which is a basic introduction to JavaScript, is pretty good here, and these are prerequisites. So installing software. So we've actually already done this part where we've installed VS Code, we've set it up, we've shown you how to run a server locally. We've done that stuff. HTML, like I said, we're not going to cover HTML and CSS, although I do have a class, and some of you may be taking this 82 Introduction to Web and then 85 on the backside that dives specifically into those two topics. If you want to know more about those, let me know. So then when we get here to JavaScript basics, finally, after going a few sections deep, right, this kind of then steps back and gives you, I would say, a little more general introduction. And I think it is good to read this, right? So we're adding interactivity to a website. That's like its most fundamental function. It was created by Brandon Ike. Joke about that. It was created in 2 days, which may make you think it's not got a lot of depth, but since he created it, it's been updated so much, which goes back to that other screen talking about the links or the different versions that we have. So we already kind of did a Hello World example, right? So this is kind of where, in the scheme of things, we were at. But I want to actually go over, and we're going to write we're going to actually copy this code, and we'll talk about it as we get there. So I just want to have you here. So I did several things deep, and I ended up getting into the JavaScript basics, right? So this is where you want to be in order for us to come back here and get some code just to have a little fun and a med. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, kind of now that we're here, because I use MDN a lot to organize like concepts, right? So last time we left, and this is where my editor was left, is that I wonder if I can move that, but it was left in the public. So what this work is going to be in private. So what we want to do here is we're going to then, we could do this a couple ways. Like I could, you can see the recent, right? So I could open this, right? So I can just say open recent. If it's not listed, I could just go to open folder. Now again, I showed you could open the base folder, or in my case, I'm just going to open the private. So I've moved from the private repo, right, to the, from the public repo to the private, because when we're doing the code along assignments, we'll be working inside of the private, which is just between you and I. Okay, so this is our first code along. So what I'm going to have you do is create a folder. So new folder here. Okay, we're going to call this week 2 because we're in week 2. Okay, and we'll just hit enter here. Okay, cool. And now in here, and this is a good review, right? We're going to go ahead and create that index.html file. Going to do the exclamation mark. Hit tab to get that HTML standard template tags, right? We haven't talked about tags, but again, they're pretty self-explanatory. They're nested in general, right? So we have the head tag, right? And then we have the body tag. We have also it all wrapped up in the HTML tag. So in this sense, we have an opening and a closing tag. All right, so we need it. So last time, the other thing we did, and we'll do that again, is we're going to create another file. Okay. So this file, again, I called it main.js, right? And then last time we wrote some code. Okay, but this time we're actually not going to yet. So now coming back here, right? Last time I had you do this, right? I had you actually go script. And then in the script, and this is where, there's different places we could write JavaScript. Now at this point, I have a main.js file, but I actually haven't connected it into my HTML document. So in here, I could actually write JavaScript commands, right? I could say hello from inside the HTML, right? So if we do this, right, here, we can go ahead and hit go live or just open up the file in the browser, right? When we do that, we don't see anything if we right-click inspect, because remember, console.log is going to be on the console. So let's come here, right? And then here we go. And that failure to load resources. Matter of fact, let me make this a little bigger so we can see it, right? So that live reload is what I was talking about before. When you make changes, you can automatically see it. So now we can see, and if you are here, matter of fact, as soon as you right click and hit inspect, it automatically takes you to elements. And if you don't have the console listed, if you have it listed over somewhere else, right, you can bring it here. Oh, sorry. Console here. And this is just a matter of making it show. It might actually come to here, and you would just want to go to console. So that way you can see hello from the inside of, should be inside inside the HTML. Now, this is a fine way, well, I don't know if it's a fine way, but it's a way to write JavaScript. But it's not the way we're going to write JavaScript for this class, but you actually may see that written this way, okay? So, and the other thing is, and we're going to talk about this as we write more in our other file, is there's, at the end of every JavaScript line, there is a whole discussion about if you should include semicolons, okay? And so I thought this morning as I was looking at this, I thought I'm going to go over and actually ask chat about this, because I was curious what they had to say right? And it says the use of semicolons is a matter of personal preference, but it's also a matter of good style, of understanding that JavaScript will so it inject automatically insertion of a semicolon in certain circumstances. You can also have your editor do it for you. Actually played around with that a bit this morning, and it was kind of fun. So then it talks about, right, there's a few things to consider: consistency, the insertion, because sometimes you may, if you don't do it, JavaScript may interpret something incorrectly. We won't run into this until we write more involved code. And this is an important one: minification and compression. And that's just because when you actually do, there's programs to minify and compress your code, those semicolons become really important there. Although again, it will handle most again, editors or the language itself. Ultimately, whether you use it or not, it's a matter of personal preference, but it's worth noting that majority choose to use them. So we will use them in this course, okay? So from now on, and I was trying to move over here, when we're writing JavaScript, at the end of our line, we'll put a semicolon, okay? All right, so let me go back to kind of looking at our topic. So I've talked about MDN, I talked about semicolons at this point. I've shown you at least, and this is kind of getting into here, different ways to do it, but this is what I want to do before we go any further, is to understand the way I grade, right, in this class, your code along work, is through your commit messages, because what it shows me is that you're following along. Because what will happen as we're working through the course is you will have different things that you'll code along with me, and then I may have you do like a coding challenge. And so this is the way that I use to evaluate the work that you're doing, is through these commit messages. And the commit messages are part of the Git workflow. So let's go ahead and just get comfortable, right? So here's your first commit. So when it says commit message like this, that means, right, now that we've covered these topics, now you need to do a commit. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so now that I'm here, right, I don't have my terminal showing up, so I could go new terminal. I'm on my Mac. Actually, I ended up using Bash, but I could use Giz as well here, which is kind of more standard on the Mac, but it's okay, it doesn't really matter. And now I'm going to do git status, and it shows me I have a W2, that folder, right? And there's untracked files now. It's just looking at the folder. I think if I was to do, let me clear this. If I was to change into W2, let's see if I do git status here, would it tell me the files? No, it doesn't actually, because I have to do the folder. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go ahead and we can either do it here, git add, how about git add star? Good, so now I've added them, I've staged them, right? Git, let me clear this to make this git commit -m, and I actually gave you the message I wanted to use, mdn and semicolons, right? All right, so now I have them in here. Okay, so because I had made a new folder, they weren't being listed when I listed them on git status, because it wanted me to version control those files first. But now if I went in and I was to, and we're going to end up doing this next actually, right? And by the way, you don't have to do the push until we're completely done and you're ready to push your code and then submit it into Canvas, okay? So as you're coding along, don't worry about pushing. Now, you can, not a problem, right? If you're just more comfortable knowing that your code has been pushed, and again, if just a review about that. So if I was, and it's good to bring this up, right? So if I'm on 93 and I'm on my private repo, right? That folder's not there because I've only version controlled it locally. Okay, so I've shown you here how we can put a script file. We can also, and I can just select this and drag it down, we could also put it in the body right, anywhere in there. But again, that's kind of, I mean, there may be situations where you want to do that, but typically, and I'm going to undo this, right? So all I did was selected it, right? And this is just and you can drag it down to where you want it, and you can see how the editor allows you to do that. But ultimately what we want to do is write it in a separate file because it's just cleaner and it's more manageable, and there'll be other things that we'll use like modules as we move forward to make that code writing even more organized. Okay, so at this point let's go ahead. We are going to use the script file, the script tag. We still need it, but in this case let's just get rid of it and rewrite it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit tab. Now the reason I'm hitting tab here is actually to align it. Now I could, and that's part of what the prettier formatter will do for us, will actually make this thing prettier, and I'll show you that as we move forward. So I'll go ahead and do script again. Okay, again it did the opening and the closing, and actually let's do that again, because if I remember right, when we were doing this, I'm going to do undo, right? If I do script, yeah, so it'll actually do the source for me so I don't have to type that, and then I can type main. Again, the editor is just trying to help me. If I hit tab, it'll just basically auto-complete. There's actually something called IntelliSense. Okay, so now we're here. We still don't have anything in this file, right? But we're going to put something in there now. Okay. Remember, we're saving along the way because that auto save is set up. If you don't have that saved, you want to have that done. Anything we're doing is still being updated into the live server, which is great, and we're ready to see that happen. So now I'm going to move back to here, right? And so in this case, the way we wrote the script tag before, right? Well, actually, let's come back to that. Actually, let's do this. Let's go ahead and type, we're going to copy this code. Okay, so copy this code. There's sometimes copying code is fine, and by the way, there's a little icon here to copy it as well if you don't want to select it and copy it. And this is JS, and we're going to be talking about this as we move through the course, and this is more of what we call in the DOM itself. And so we'll talk about variables next, but you're basically defining a variable called myHeading. You're saying, look in my document. My document is the index file. Look for a query selector, select H1. And so right now we don't have an H1, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do H1. I'm going to say Rio's file, web page. Okay, cool, right? Right, and so now what it's going to say is it's going to say now, because this variable represents that, and I can show you this in DevTools. It's kind of fun to see what it's pointing to, but it's basically saying find the reference to look at the document, find the H1, store that reference in heading. The heading then set the text content to hello world. Right now we have the heading 1 content set to Rio's page, or you could use your name, right? So if we went over here, based on this code and what you know so far, okay, what would be your guess for what's going to show up on the page? Okay, let's go look. Right, Rio's page. And look at this. On DevTools, we actually have an error. It's saying cannot set properties of null, meaning it couldn't find anything when setting the text content. Okay, so we have our first error, right? Now what's kind of interesting is we don't get an error here. We're getting it on DevTools, which is part of why I love DevTools, is that and there is ways we could set up VS Code to more likely show them, but in this case it's just good to have them here. Okay? So let's go back and look at JavaScript reference in MDN and look at where, right? Now it actually used a folder called scripts, which, we could do that. We could maybe start doing that next. That'd be a good idea. And it did create main.js, but when it did the source. But so in your HTML, enter the new line, just before the closing. Just before the closing. And we put ours up in the head section. So the question would be, does that make a difference? Well, let's see. Okay, so if I put it down here, now again, what would we expect this code to do? We would expect it to actually have that H1 be this content. And notice how semicolons came over. That's because of the copy and paste, it already included them. So now what do we think that page would look like? And it would be hello world. Okay. Now why is that? Here's why. Because when in the HTML, when we had it, I'm just going to undo for a second here, it was loading this at the page load when it's rendering the page, and it ran this code. But what happened is it ran this code, this JS that we have here, before the actual H1 got created. So in this case, MDN is talking about, hey, just put it, right? Put it before the close. But there's actually a better way, and I know it talks about it later, okay? Which, by the way, I definitely recommend reading through this page, because there's just a lot of, oh, and look, there's the semicolon, right? So we'll talk about variables next, but this is a good article just to look through, because it is a good basic. I think it's written to people hopefully with a more basic view. Beginning students is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so there's another thing we can do, actually just in here. We can actually just type defer. Oh, and put a space. So what these are is these are tags and these are attributes. Okay, so this attribute doesn't have any associated value. It just says defer. Okay, so by putting defer in there now, right? So what will happen now is, again, I moved it back up into the head section. So I would think possibly it might break, but it actually is working the way we'd expect, okay? Because of this defer. It's basically saying wait until the page is loaded. The page is rendered, not loaded. Well, it is loaded, but it's also what we call rendered into the DOM, okay? Okay, so we've talked about different ways to include it. We're basically just doing it as an external file. We've talked about the defer. We've shown you an example. So before we end this one though, because I hope you've gotten something from this, I want to show you another real benefit, okay, of using DevTools, okay, before we end this one and you get to do your final commit, is over here we can also go to source, and under source you can click on main, and here's where, right, we could, and all I'm doing is clicking here. Okay, let me do it this way. By having this is the code that's running when the page is being rendered, okay, after the DOM elements, that's the H1, has been set up to allow it to update that content, okay? What's kind of cool here is that my heading is a variable. You can actually just type my heading down here, and notice what happens up when you do that, right? Right. It actually does a couple of things. It shows you what the variable my heading has a reference to, so that's H1, right? And so we could actually do my heading. Try that again. My heading dot text, because we could write right on the console, and we could say equals. Now we'll talk about what equals does here. Hello from the console. Right. So what we're doing here is the page is already loaded. We're running some JavaScript that modifies the page after it's already been loaded, because we're modifying really, and I'm going to hit up arrow, we're modifying from the console to update the DOM, right? Which is kind of cool. DOM is a document object model. So this is what we, once the page is rendered, and the more you learn JavaScript, there's just so much about the DOM you will learn. But it's basically, it's the same idea. Let me go ahead and hit enter here, right? So when you do document, right, it's the whole page. So that DOM is an object, you'll hear about this in a little while, that represents all that HTML that was rendered to the page. Okay, so we've done a couple things here. So now you're ready to do your commit right before you're ready to submit this assignment. So let's go ahead. We're in here. So we're going to do get status. So now our get status is going to look different because we have two files that we had already tracked that were now modified. So we do get add star. We stage it. I'm going to clear. Now remember, go back over here because I actually have, right? So I'm going to copy it because I can and you can too. So now I'm going to do get commit -m. I'm going to paste that. Make sure you don't. You could actually probably bring over the quotes. Sometimes the quotes when you're pasting them can throw this off, right? So different ways to write and run JavaScript. We didn't even talk about Node. We could talk about that, but we'll get there. Good. So now I've committed it. So now I have all my changes done. I have all my work done to submit this. I'm going to submit a URL, but I'll show you how the URL will look a little different. Because the first thing we want to do, and I meant to go over here to show you, it's still not here because all the work we've done is local. And so now we do get push. And get push sends all those, and I'm going to do a refresh. All those changes now have come over to here. And so what's cool is, before I had you submit the URL, now I'm going to have you submit your commits because this is how I grade, right? So now, look at this, right? So these were the original ones, and now these are the two that I can see that were done. And then what I do is I go in and look to see if you coded along. So how you submit this is you come up here, copy this, right? Actually, I could show you. Actually, we'll talk about that another time. I don't want to. This is getting a little longer than I wanted anyway. So here's what you do: is when you go to submit this assignment. Okay, when you submit the URL, you'll just paste in the URL I just showed you here. Okay, so that's how you'll submit this one. All right, talk to you later.